Now, the National Science Foundation explains that the goal of the ERC program is to, you all know this, but I'm just going to read this as our kind of intro here, is to integrate engineering research and education with technological innovation to transform national prosperity, health, and security. And NSF describes its engineering research centers as places that have innovative, inclusive cultures to cultivate new ideas and pursue engineering discovery. And one of the principal questions that comes up during in ERC's lifetime is it comes up during it came up during the initial proposal stage, and it comes up every year in the site visits, right? Is why is a center necessary? Like, why can't just the individual research suffice? And that's because NSF acknowledges that engineering research centers are special organizations, not just a cluster of researchers. And so as an organization, then there's all sorts of amazing and wonderful stuff from organizational studies research that we can bring over that applies to an ERC as an organization. And that's where leadership research comes from, and how organizations function or malfunction, and people's behavior in organizations. All of that is over there, and that's what we're bringing, you know, some of this leadership information over and using that and applying it to the engineering context. Because in the context matters, that the in engineering piece of this leadership perspective really matters. So recently, ASU's Professor Nancy Cook chaired a committee on the science of team science, and that committee reported, as part of their examination of the concept of leadership in doing team science, they included this statement that leadership is not a quality that an individual either has or lacks. Rather, leadership is an emergent property of groups of people. That means leadership is multifaceted and complex. But at the same time, leadership is really diffuse. And it's what leadership actually consists of is just ordinary human behavior. So that makes leadership this kind of slippery thing to grab a hold of. So I'm using this, oh, can we move that? There we go. So I'm gonna start this video of this. Let's just watch it. So you probably have seen this type of thing before, murmurations in flocks of birds or schools of fish. And the actual patterns and designs and shapes that are created, those are emergent properties of that particular group of individuals in that particular context. And I think that works as a really good analogy for thinking of like what leadership is. Because there isn't like one of those birds that's saying, hey, follow me, everybody, come on, let's go this way and we're gonna make this, right? That's not what's happening. What's actually happening, the people who study those birds, is there's about 3 incredibly, really simple rules that every bird in that flock is following, those same very, very simple 3 rules. And while each bird does each of those simple rules, the result is this very complex group behavior. And that serves as a really good analogy for leadership in groups, because we do the same thing as human beings. We're following really simple rules, social norms, whether we realize it or not. We're following certain kinds of practices and behaviors. And that collective following of those practices and behaviors results in of this emergent group property. So here's a definition of just the leadership part that I'd like to offer. And there's a lot of leader development books, classes, programs, schools, all kinds of things that focuses on individual people. And we're going to teach you specific things so that you can improve your ability to be a leader. That is something that's taking a slightly different perspective within the realm of leadership than this. I'm not saying it's not valid. It is. That can be very valuable for individuals to learn individual skills in the areas of communication and relationship building and negotiation and all kinds of things like that that can be very helpful. But that kind of work is called leader development. It's not the same thing as leadership development, because leadership focuses on the group. Now, another thing that can be befuddling in the area of leadership is this notion that, well, how does it relate to management then? Is leadership and management the same thing? How do they relate to each other? So let's go through that. And the images we're going to go through here come from Simonet and Tett's work. They've done a lot of work in the area of leadership and management. They performed a large study where they got some subject matter experts on leadership and management. They listed 64 items that you could think of them as these individual behaviors or these practices, these individual practices, and asked these subject matter experts, is this practice, is that just leadership, just management, or is it both? And we're going to look at that in a second. But let's first look at how individuals tend to think of leadership and management and how they relate. And you might find the imagery that matches yours up here. So some people think leadership, management, two totally separate things. They never meet. You got leadership is all this over here. It's totally different than management. That's that stuff over there. And they're two totally separate things. You need leaders in organizations and you need managers, and they're not the same people. That's how some people think. Then another way of thinking of it is some people are like, it's the same. There's no difference. Leadership is just the new fancy word for management. Leadership management doesn't matter what you call it. Come on now. Then there's those who think leadership is a subset within management, and of course, the vice versa, the opposite of that, right? And then there's the notion that there are some distinct behaviors and practices that are just management and some that are just leadership. And then there's an awful lot of overlap. And the overlap depends on the context, the organization that this is happening in, the culture that it's happening in, the industry that it's happening in, and the understanding of how these are related that is most commonly agreed upon within leadership studies is this last one. That there are some things that are distinct about each of them, but that they have a great deal of overlap, and that individuals can display both kinds of practices, the same individuals. So those individual words that these researchers sent out, these are some of them. So here's some that were just management kinds of activities. These were just leadership kinds of activities. And what I've included here isn't the full list. I just gave some examples. And the green ones in the center are where a lot of the overlap is. Now, let's look at a couple of these. Let's look at motivating intrinsically that's over here on the leadership side, and we have something else over here. I'm not very good at circling. I didn't mean to include that. Motivating extrinsically. Let's take a look at these two and do a little exercise. It's on your handout. We're going to do a little exercise with these two. So just to kind of dig into this and get a sense of what does that actually mean, motivating, and that whole leadership management, it doesn't mean that one's good, one's bad. There isn't a value that's placed on that. Management and leadership are both needed in organizations to help them be successful. So in this exercise, what we're going to do is I want you to think of some examples of situations or where there was a focus on motivating extrinsically. And two of the verbs that you can think about to help trigger you, like, well, how would I know when there was a focus on extrinsic motivation? Two of the verbs you can think of are make and get. So if there were people asking questions like, how can we make people go to the webinars? If there was a conversation around how can we make people go to the webinars? How can we get people to attend the meetings, the blah, blah, blah meetings? So all of that, when that is the focus and people are like, how can we do that? That is a focus on motivating extras. And alternatively, a focus on motivating intrinsically, you could flip out the words make and get and replace them with the words let and allow. And so then you're asking yourself, how can we allow people to go to the webinars? And you might think, well, of course we allow them to go to the webinars. We don't prevent them. But what the let and allow side really means is like, how can we foster an environment that rewards people for this kind of behavior? It's still their choice. It's totally their choice. But how can the environment itself be structured? It's kind of like a lot of the research you do where you're like creating an environment that fosters all the microbes getting along with each other, and you're not controlling. Now you go do this with this one, so that one produces one, right? You're like creating an environment that fosters all of them. That's the same kinds of ideas that's on this motivating intrinsically side. So I want you to just pair up with somebody. If you're online and you're doing this by yourself, just jot down a couple of things on each side that you can think of that were situations where the focus was on motivating extrinsically and then the focus was on motivating intrinsically.
I have a question.
Yes.
So when you say how do we allow people to come?
Oh, yeah, that's a good
Yeah,
idea.
that's the thing that comes to mind. The webinar is so great.
Yes.
Everyone wants to come.
I know.
To allow them to come.
Those are always like, how do we make them?
I know, I was
Yes. So how would you do that? Like, how would it be like, what if these webinars were like TED Talks and everybody, and it was like the seats were getting sold out and there wasn't enough room for everybody and all this, like how would you create that sort of excitement?
Make them do the webinar.
And everything around. Yes. Yeah, that's it. Absolutely. That's an excellent example.
Yeah.
How do we get?
As we were like, this exercise isn't for us to say,
Videos don't.
this is all good and this is bad, or this is all good and that's bad. It's really just to like stretch the ideas. Like there's a lot of great ideas on both sides of the spectrum.
What?
You don't get funded if you don't go.
That's not bribery, that's punishment.
That's a rule.
It's on our list of, there's a list of punishment.
So I'm using my little.
Do you guys want to share? Share out any of your ideas? You don't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah?
So we're always struggling with outreach, getting people
Yeah.
to make and get people to.
Yeah, you're gonna hear these words differently. So to say hi, you'll go like, oh my God, there's that make and get.
Yeah, and it doesn't work at all. But even the harder we make and get does not work, even though it's required. So we even realized we're like a requirement it still doesn't work. So then we were looking at how you could let and allow, and one thing that came up was adding value to the student. Like to say I did these out or rejected these isn't helpful for your CV, but if you have videos of you doing it, you win an award for outreach, those things I can add value for me and I can put that on my resume. So you're saying if I put I'm great at outreach on my resume, no one can prove that. Whereas if I publish a paper, they can read that paper. But if I say go to the CBBG website and you can see me doing outreach, it's actually something tangible. Yeah.
Right, and and how things are framed, right? Like outreach is like mini teaching, right? There's like, right? You're like teaching in miniature, right? You're like teaching these little mini lessons. And what if the mini lessons were like written up? And there aren't, some of them are, right? On those like handout sheets, right? So that's like encapsulating it in a way that it can be lines on your CV. Yeah, yeah, excellent. You guys want to share some of yours?
I'll share a couple. So, on the left side here, with the extrinsic, I mean, you basically have rules that can be enforced positively or negatively. Right? So you make it very clear the rules, and you put it here. On the other side, you're trying to get people to understand the self-interest, their own self-interest in doing something. And a word I wrote down here is culture. You want to create a culture where people take pride in not only themselves, but the whole group's interests, achievements, and so then you don't have to have rules, you have norms, people that everybody accepts as well. That's the way we do things, and it's everybody's best interest. So.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Excellent.
I have a suggestion following up to your comment. I had a graduate student that did not want to participate in outreach one summer. And at the end of the summer, she said that was one of her best experiences. So I will tell you later who she is. You can interview her, and if you want, you can even, put testimonials from previous students. Testimonials. What?
You made her do it.
I made her do it. I told her, we're funding you from this project. You have no choice.
So sometimes it's necessary to
Yeah.
people over.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
And I think it's necessary to create the culture because the culture doesn't come intrinsically. So sometimes you have to enforce to create the culture. But then once the culture is being created, tap on those successes and tap on those things to enhance the culture and to make that motivate intrinsically stronger one. So testimonials, we've been talking about testimonials from our previous students to recruit new students, for example.
So this is a compliment to Ed. We were just at the NSF ERC meeting 2 weeks ago, and people were standing up saying how hard it is to get faculty involved in outreach. And then Ed leans over and he goes, well, we've got people involved. Well, so far, we've got a good beginning of this culture that you're talking about, Bruce. We've got a long way to go, and we're struggling with how do we get more people involved. But it was pretty clear at that meeting that there are other ERCs where nobody wants to do anything. So there's a beginning of our culture, and that's all of you fostering it in your students. Maybe in the beginning you make them, like Rosie says, but we've got to start. Anyway.
You got to start.
And like you said, that feeling of pride when you demonstrate that's a big part of maintaining that culture you're talking about.
And in establishing this kind of culture, sometimes means breaking down another culture.
Yes.
And if you look around universities, the traditional culture is it's everybody for himself or herself.
Yes.
And there isn't a culture of cooperating and collaborating. That's a really new idea. And in many ways, we have to fight against the prevailing larger culture. So you have to break down old cultures in order to build up new cultures sometimes.
Absolutely.
You could also turn it around,
You're
saying,
spot on.
saying in some cases, I like to do outreach, but I should be made to stop doing all this outreach and start publishing. And so there's the other.
You get that
Well,
feedback.
the lesson allow, it's great to get REUs that are good students, right? So you
Yeah.
guys allow us to get these great students, to work in our labs for 2 or 3 months. I don't know, there's some positive thinking here.
Thank you for participating in that exercise. That was really good. I appreciate that. So this is straight out of NSF's text about the ERCs, how inclusion is defined. And it really is just verbalizing a lot of the things that many of you were saying. That collaboration. But the inclusion, full inclusion, is still an elusive. It's an elusive construct to achieve an organizational culture that's fully inclusive, that anyone would walk into and say, oh, absolutely, what's going on here is fully inclusive. So just for an example, I did this Google search on inclusion is elusive, and I got almost 30 million results.
How do we define inclusion? In order to discuss.
Oh, let's just go back. So this is NSF's definition. So I'm not, because you are absolutely right. You're bringing up a great point that there are many different definitions. So it wouldn't be helpful to apply somebody else's definition of inclusion to the ERC. We're just using this one. But you're right, in that search, it's like, well, how do we know what definition of inclusion people are using? Excellent point on this. Well, of course there's almost 30 million results. So let's narrow that down. And let's go to Google Scholar, just Google Scholar, and let's just focus on this idea of social inclusion. Because in Google Scholar, if I put in inclusion, I've got all kinds of biological constructs and things that are inclusion, but they're not the concept of inclusion that NSF was talking about when they talked about the aspects of diversity and inclusion. So I narrowed it down to a social inclusion. And it is elusive. It's widely studied. There's a lot of work going on around it. And yet, remember that one of those first slides, NSF says that the ERCs are inclusive. So we have this kind of, it says that they have inclusive cultures. It doesn't say they're working toward it. It doesn't say they're making progress, that, right? It says they are inclusive cultures. So it's kind of it's kind of this.
They are born.
Yeah, they were. Like right when they were created, they are. You walk in them and right. So that kind of sets up a interesting situation. So let's focus in on this word inclusion for a second. And why is that word inclusive? Inclusive. Why am I tacking that on the front of leadership? Inclusive leadership. Why isn't it just leadership? Why aren't we just talking about leadership in engineering? Why is it inclusive leadership? So as an analogy, I want us to think about when you go to the grocery store, you see, it's the kind with the real cocoa, and this is the real vegetable chips. And the products tell you what they don't have in them as much as they tell you what they do have in them. And with the real this and the real that. And this is I'll say a relatively recent phenomena, right? So why does that word real have to why has it been tacked on the front of product labels? Relatively recent. It's a what?
We eat so much chemistry, so real means no chemistry.
Right, like we got to tell you it's real, because if there's no adjective in front of it, then the assumption is it's not real, it's artificial or it's imitation, right? So our life, and we're used to this. Seems perfectly normal to us that if the word has no adjective in front of it, it's probably fake. So you have to add a word in front of something to delineate that is the real thing. So that's kind of what's going on with like putting inclusive in front of the word leadership, because within leadership studies, the leadership should be inclusive. There shouldn't ever be, like, it couldn't even be called leadership if it wasn't inclusive, right? Like that would be powership, or that would be bullyship, or that would be controllership or dictatorship or something. It wouldn't be leadership if it wasn't inclusive. But that word leadership has kind of been co-opted by societies to mean a lot of different things. A lot of times that word gets used to mean just to refer to a particular position in an organization. That's called leadership, and just that position. But that's not how we're using it.
Or metrics.
Or
Metrics. Like, you're a leader because
Yes.
you raise profits by 2%.
Right. Yes. Right. Yes, it's like and that's how, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's how NSF uses the word leadership a lot in their writing. They talk about the United States must maintain that leadership position the world around in terms of this kind of science and this and this and this and this. That's how they use that word leadership a lot. So now we're going to do another little exercise. This is on your handout. On the back of page 1 is your next exercise. So we're talking about, so what really, okay, let's try to dig in there. We're talking about this idea of that adjective being on the front of leadership. So, and you were bringing up before about the social norms. Like they typically were, everybody in it for themselves, compete, don't tell anybody about what you're working on, because you've got to maintain your little world of specialty area, right? And you're talking about, okay, so that's being exclusive and being protectionary around your stuff and proprietary. So in order to then move to being inclusive, so if you just stop doing that, would that get you to inclusion? Like I'm not gonna, if someone asks me for a copy of my preliminary results, I'm not gonna say no. Like, is anybody even gonna know that you decided that? Like, does that really, if this had been your starting position and now you're like, well, I'll stop balking at sharing my stuff, does that get you to inclusion? You do need to do more than that. You need to do more than just stopping the exclusionary things, because the exclusionary things had been done. It's like just exactly, this worksheet is exactly what you were talking about. So go ahead and meet with your group and try to fill in a couple more of the boxes in terms of what are some exclusionary type practices or norms that you can think of.
So like depends on what you need.
Yeah.
Finish this one. It's interesting.
I've been looking at it, I'm like, why is that cactus producing gazebo? I'm like, oh, this is all.
They
I'm just
can
trying to
just
think
talk
who's
and we'll hear them. Oh,
They have to unmute themselves.
unless they muted themselves. Who's online? Who's participating online?
NMSU, I think.
Please share I apologize profusely. Please
Miriam and NMSU, I think, are the ones online.
type up.
Jason's online.
Oh,
Jason's online.
Colleen's online.
Jason, Colleen,
Maybe they can share some ideas. That would be fun.
it would, yeah.
Yes, please do. So any volunteers of our online participants? We would love to hear some of your ideas from this exercise or the previous exercise.
Jason, Paula.
This is Jason DeYoung. I think the only comment I would make at this point in time is I agree with what you're saying in the table is when we have issues both on campus or within our groups here and also within the center, if we identify something's an issue, stopping doing the thing that is an issue is not a fix. It's just a hold on the situation. But the only way to remedy something is actually to swing in the opposite direction and be intentional about inclusion or intentional about changing what the culture is. So just to stop doing something is not it, but you have to actually move in the other direction and become active.
That's a good point.
Thank you.
So this is Martha from NMSU. And so Peter and I were talking about kind of when we were thinking about being inclusive, and we kind of got to talking about communication, and we talked about different kinds of things, but we were talking some about just how we interact within NMSU and how actually we got to talking about something specific about strategies about how we be more inclusive with some of our activities here. So we got a little topical because we could talk about something specific, but trying to improve our communication so that we could be more inclusive in some of our activities.
That's fantastic. I'm really glad that you were able to dig right into an actual real
Situation, yeah, real topic that has to do with us being a little more spread out around campus, yeah.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. That geographic dispersal certainly makes it all much more challenging. I'm glad. Thank you.
If I could add something too, going off of what Jason said about actively seeking out people to be more inclusive, it happens both at the student level and at the professor level. Like, I recommended people who were not civil engineers, and I was sort of nervous about it because they don't have any of the information, I thought. But I mean, I have 3 undergrads working under me right now, and none of them are civil engineers. So it happens both at the students where I recommend my friends or people I know, and then it branches out more and more because they know people who aren't geotechs or civils either.
That's a fantastic comment you make, because there's some risk involved there, and we were talking about that moving out into that new space, like Jason was mentioning, there is some risk for the person who's doing that. There's some risk involved, and the culture, back to what we were talking about, that culture needs to allow for and support the individuals who are taking those risks, and it needs to provide the kind of like that protection, like sort of the insurance for that risk-taking behavior. Absolutely, because the risk-taking behavior is beneficial to the organization as a whole.
Yeah, and it's a risk for the person recommending them because they don't know if that person's going to get the job or be interested in it. But it's also a risk for the person looking to be a part of the center because they're wondering, well, how does this apply to my major? What type of skills can I get out of this? And maybe we need to make it more like, this is not just going to give you geotechnical engineering information. This is going to build up your presentation skills and your networking skills and give you knowledge in other areas. So maybe we need to make sure that information is more distributed.
Excellent point. Thank you.
And I guess I would add to that. I've been very happy to be part of some of the committees of several of the master's students in civil engineering. I do recognize, and I think this is always true, that it's that I do bring a very different perspective coming from chemical engineering, and I appreciate being able to be part of those committees. But it is, we do our challenge by coming at things from a different perspective. So I think as we come together with our different, I come at it from a slightly different perspective. So as we hear people come at it, I'm always asking what the zeolite is and what the iron oxide coating is, and I'm always asking questions that are just not the ones that civil engineers are really all that interested in. But just to kind of be cognizant that people are going to have different perspectives.
Absolutely, that's an excellent point.
I think that brings value, actually.
It does.
Yeah.
It does bring value. And then the organization and the way it demonstrates that that's valued, it needs to be these like tangible manifest actions so that that's recognizable that that's a valued thing. The value isn't just in someone's mind thinking, oh, I value that. There needs to be tangible things occurring that demonstrate that it's valued. Yep. Wonderful. Anybody else online? All right, thank you. Those were wonderful contributions. All right, so now we're going to look quickly at just one. There's many studies about inclusive. That's that's intentional. It's part of my slide
Also,
presentation.
for the slide.
Oh.
Oh. So this is some recent research just published very recently. So I'll let you read the research questions there.
This is one.
Yeah, that's why I added the sound, because you're just reading it yourself. Okay, so let's look at their data.
Depending on the discipline, what about the discipline?
Oh, you'll see
I
that.
would assume.
Oh, yeah, that's, they vary by field. Excellent. So you're right there, like you're right there. Okay, let's look at their data. So here are their data. They used 1,285 responses from a survey that was given to recent PhD graduates from just one Big Ten institution.
Which institution do we know?
They didn't say.
So 6 publications, is it per year?
Because I think that would be.
Is it per year or total?
Oh,
Total, sorry.
oh, at PhD.
Number.
Right, so this is this is the number, the total number for those PhD. They just recently graduated, so this was like their whole experience, their whole, you know, their whole time and that they had available to contribute to any publications.
What are the dots?
The dots are the outliers.
Oh,
Or what you think might be an outlier.
Statistics.
Well, according to the statistical
Yeah.
formulas that they use to show the averages, the
if you're more than 3 times.
rate, the averages, the range, not the range, but the whatever the ends and whisper points are called, and then the outliers. Yes. That's what their data.
That's what that is.
Yeah. Yep, that's what their data look like.
I know, only education, more females, because there are.
Right, and this is just looking at gender. But okay, so just from an inclusive perspective, does anybody have some thoughts about, well, they're just following some norms here that maybe they're in the way they conducted their study wasn't even being all that inclusive. They have a gender binary. That's all they use, right? Was a gender binary. That's not how everybody identifies themselves, but that's what they use. It's just the gender binary, male. And they called it sex, not gender. You know, so there's some issues of inclusiveness even in the way that they conducted their study. Well, here's some things that the folks who did the study had to say about it, just a few comments. So they did point out that the engineering and physical sciences groups they thought were in particular had some startling gaps. And most of those gaps, except for the ones down here on the humanities or the education side, those were all significant. The differences between them were past the rules for indicating significance. And this is just a couple of quotes of what they said that could be done. And it's the same comments that you guys have been making here, that you all have been making here. It has to do with the culture. Every faculty member is contributing to the development of that culture. Not only the faculty, but the grad students, everybody needs to be rewarded for their participation. Sure, please. Now we're going to go back to birds. Back to birds. So these birds that you're looking at here in this image, these are ibis. And amazing research has been done with not just ibis, but other flocking birds too. But this particular research that I'm referencing here, what they discovered, their study was really on aerodynamics and upwash and downwash and vortexes and all kinds of fascinating stuff like that. But we're not going to talk about that. But some other things that they discovered is what these birds do is in forming the V formations, the birds pair up. They're not playing follow the leader, they pair up. And they consistently tend to pair up with the same partner. And the partner that they're pairing up with when they fly is not the same bird that they like to hang out with when they're on the ground.
Wow, that's
It's their flying partner. And what they do when they're flying, to make that V, birds are flying off the wing of the other one to avoid the downwash and catch the upwash and avoid the vortexes and all that, so that the bird in the behind position uses less energy to fly, right? Well, what they do in these pairs, and this is how they know that there are pairs, is they take turns.
Yeah.
And what triggers the turn-taking behavior is not that the one in the front is tired. That's not the trigger for the change in behavior, the change in position. Whatever is the trigger is unique to the bird pairs. They're making that decision to switch positions based on their own behaviors. It's not correlated to the one in the lead getting what we would call tired. So the entire V then is made up of these pairs. And some pairs tend to like to be in this part of the V, and some pairs some pairs like to move around. But it's pair specific behavior. So there's a lot of what that large group B thing, they're not focused on that. They're just focused on their buddy, their flying buddy, and doing their own flying buddy thing. And the whole V gets created out of that. So there's this whole stuff around reciprocity that's going on with these bird pairs. And so just briefly, quickly, your last exercise is to focus on this idea of pairwise reciprocity. Like, what is it in your world that is pairwise reciprocity that is occurring? Because if you think about it, you know, you have like a relationship with this colleague, you have a relationship with this one, you have your relationship with this one, and you have within those, each of those individual two-person relationships, you have some understandings of reciprocity that you enact in that relationship. And through the enactment of those reciprocal paired relationships, that then is generating and creating the energy that is needed within the organization. And that's where your culture comes from. That's where your leadership comes from too. So I just want you to jot down just a few thoughts or a few notions about.
Is it always in pairs?
I'm sorry.
Or can you have threesomes or more group type of?
That machine hums up there. It's really hard for me to hear.
I said it's always pairs, or can it be also some teams of 3 or 4 or not 4? The bigger, the more complex, I guess.
Right. Absolutely. If you're like, oh, I'm not really thinking in terms of pairs, I'm thinking in terms of 3s and 4s, then go ahead, write that down. But it's the idea of reciprocity. Like, what is in that relationship that is reciprocal?
We're doing our reciprocity of co-teaching.
Excellent. All right. And that's excellent, because the next thing is the quiz.
Oh, you could,
You want us to
Yeah,
do
back,
those?
or no, oh no, it was just the announcement that, yeah, I do want the quiz on the back. We're collecting those. Now let's check. Yep. And the only other thing I wanted to announce is that I'm working on developing a course called Inclusive Leadership in Engineering. It'll be a part of the Leadership Masters program that we have in College of Integrative Sciences and Arts. We're looking right now, it should be available in 2019. It'll be open to students, you know, it isn't just going to be closed to just our students, just our master's students can take it, anybody could take it. Even outside of ASU could take it. It'll be open. Yeah, and then we wanted folks to do the knowledge check. That's in your handout.
thank you.
Thank you. So I know I rushed through there for the online folks. Let's back up a little bit. Were there questions about the birds or the reciprocity examples or ideas that people had about that?
You know, the funny part, so I'm the education director, right? And I think about all the people we all participate with. But when the first thing that comes to my mind is fun, enjoyment, like enjoy everybody. So we get the job done, but it's fun. And maybe that's the case for a lot of us with our partners.
That ties in well with like what we were talking about on the intrinsic motivation part too. Yes, absolutely. The fun, like How do we foster fun? Right, absolutely.
Well, I was going to say kind of what Rosie was talking about earlier, that, you know, having the reciprocity pairing or whatever is having maybe like our summer programs where we have these undergrads that are looking for experiences, you know, to work in the lab and work on a research team. But then the faculty and the grad students are, you know, having this person come in and helping on something that they're working on. So that's
Absolutely.
kind of
Yeah, that's a great example because that mentoring relationship is, you know, we're like intentionally pairing them up with somebody and we're structuring that relationship so that both can benefit from it. So that's a reciprocal relationship. Absolutely. That's a terrific example.
I had that one too, with the student perspective. The young scholar in REUs working with me in the lab, like they're doing work for me and to help me. But in return, not only are they learning how to work in the lab, they get their name on publications
Right.
that I create, and they help with that.
Yes.
Which I think is a pretty good deal for a
Right.
high schooler.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Symbiotic.
It is. Yep. Online folks have some reciprocity examples. I wish I could like click on them.
I would say respect,
They do that?
There we go. Respect, yeah.
just mutual respect.
Mutual respect.
So, well, given any position or any situation, well, I'm mostly thinking about student mentoring relationships, that you realize that, well, if someone is in a certain situation or position, that you respect that position and, well, just be open about it. And then I think once you can create trust and respect between the relationship, then you can have more interaction and more stable relationship.
Exactly. Because in our human relationships within this organization, we have a lot more complex aspects to our relationships than the birds in the flock do, right? I mean, they're all peers. They're all, you know, none of those birds are earning a different salary or have a different title, right? And none of them have to report on each other or anything else like that, right? So their interactions and their decisions about that, what that relationship is like, doesn't have all those other complexities, certainly, that our human relationships definitely have. A lot more complex components to them that impact the kinds of reciprocity that we enact. Yep.
I have something to add to like Kimberly's and Leon's about reciprocity in the summer program. I had a mentee that knew more about how vegetation grows. So basically, even though I'm the leader and the mentor, I'm learning from her and she's sort of controlling more of it and teaching us. And then where her knowledge ends, I come in, and so sort of it creates a leadership position for them and then creates a joint leadership where I'm learning, but I'm also still leading.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that, I love the way you described that, because I could kind of see that like sort of organically, you know, fusing and merging and growing together like that, the way you explained it. Yeah, it's and being open to that and being willing to trust and take those risks and move in that direction and trust that the components that are needed will grow and develop and appear when they need to be there. I love the way you described that.